Arizona, southern Arizona. We're going into one of what I feel is one of the greatest museums in the Southwest. We're at the University of Arizona, and we're standing here in front of the State of Arizona Museum, and we're very fortunate that the curator, Mr. Bruce Hilpert, has invited us in. Bruce, thank you so much for the invitation. I understand you all this is your centennial year, and it shows because things really look nice inside. You have a museum that's not stale, it's moving, very moving, and I thank you for that invitation now that we can go in and investigate that.
Well, thank you, Arlen. We're glad to have you here, and I think we have some exciting things to show you.
Well, great. Let's get at it.
1993 is a very exciting year for us at the Arizona State Museum, and it's our centennial year. There aren't many museums in the country that are 100 years old, and since 1893 we have been collecting, preserving, researching, and educating the public about the American Indian cultures of the Southwest. In fact, the Arizona State Museum is even older than the state of Arizona, which was a territory in 1893. We were established at the University of Arizona in 1893, and in 1935 got a new building which we are standing in today, and the museum has been located here ever since. This is a picture over here of some of our early exhibits at that time, which are very typical of those that you found in the early part of the 20th century, objects in glass cases. Today our exhibits are very different. They try to tell a story and give the public an idea of what it might have been like to have been a mammoth hunter living in Arizona 12,000 years ago. Our basic functions at the Arizona State Museum are to collect, preserve, research, and educate. And the collections really become the heart of that entire process. That's what differentiates a museum from another educational institution. You can see here some of the finest examples of our collections that we have on display in our centennial exhibit. Down here at the bottom of the case, this brown object with the sort of needle shape with a hole at one end is a bone tool, approximately 10,500 years old. We don't know the function of this, but because we can see that it was shaped and the hole cut in it, it was a tool made by humans at that time. And in a few minutes we'll talk more about what we know about the people living in Arizona 10,000 years ago. We also have here right behind that object an etched and painted shell made by the Hohokam people who lived in southern Arizona from about 1 AD to about 1450. They were farmers who dug extensive systems of irrigation canals in the southern Arizona desert. They were also created very exquisite jewelry and developed technical processes such as etching of shell and ceramic firing techniques and modeling techniques that were very impressive. Here in the corner we have a Mimbres bowl, a bowl made by the people of the Mimbres culture in western New Mexico, which is also part of the larger Mogollon culture. Our exhibits also will talk about these people who lived in southern to central Arizona and western New Mexico about the same time as the Hohokam. So these collections, and we have about 250,000 cataloged objects in our collections, form the nucleus of the museum from which we conduct research programs and education programs. Our next function is to preserve not only our collections through the use of sophisticated techniques by our conservator to preserve ceramics, preserve textiles. Many items such as this silk textile from Mexico deteriorate very rapidly if they're exposed to sunlight, to changes in humidity, and so we try to protect our collections as much as possible. But we also preserve archaeological sites and other cultural resources in the state. The Arizona State Museum is charged with the responsibility to protect these sites and issue archaeological permits to two qualified researchers in the state. Research is a backbone of our institution. Of our staff of 50 people, I think we have about 15 archaeologists, and we are actively out excavating and studying these materials to learn more about these cultures. Our research today focuses primarily on the Hohokam culture that I mentioned, and also the Anasazi people in northern Arizona. At a site called Homalavi, we have a team of researchers who are working at a site that is now a state park to study the ancestral history of people that we believe are related to the present-day Hopi. In education, we have a variety of educational programs, including our exhibit galleries, of course, which are the staple of every museum. We also have a very active program of public programs, including lecture series, film series, demonstrations, interpretive programming, cultural events, and this keeps our public program staff very busy. The exhibits at the Arizona State Museum deal with the American Indian cultures of the Southwest, ranging from the people that lived here about 12,000 years ago up to the present day. The exhibits are rather unique, however, for many museums in that they not only use our collections of materials to tell a story about a certain topic, but so much of what is known about the peoples of the Southwest was developed by researchers here at the Arizona State Museum. So it's rather unique that we have both the collections and the information developed totally here at the Arizona State Museum. So you really can't talk about the history of archaeological research in the Southwest without the Arizona State Museum playing a very, very big part in this. The exhibit section that we're standing in now deals with the Paleo-Indian peoples that lived in Arizona and throughout the southern part of North America, or most of the southern part of North America, about 12,000, at least 12,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago. Arizona was a very different place at that time. As you can see in the diorama behind me, this does not look like your typical impression of Arizona in 1990 for two reasons. The most obvious is the animals that are now extinct, such as the mammoth here with the huge curved tusks, the bison that no longer roam the Arizona desert, the camels, the saber-toothed tiger lurking over in the background there, the giant ground sloth to your left. These animals were all living in this area 12,000 years ago and have now become extinct. Part of the reason that we believe that they became extinct was that the environment that you see here in this diorama is nothing like what you see in Arizona today. That's the other reason. Today we have about 11 inches of rainfall in the southern Arizona desert. At that time, scientists estimate that we had about 40 inches of rain a year. This is about how much falls in Seattle, Washington today. So you can see that that made a climate that was much greener. We had probably large plains with lush grasses, a lot of trees that provided plenty of forage for these now extinct animals. You can see one other animal over here in the corner that is still here in the southern Arizona desert today, and that's human beings. We see here a hunter who is stalking his prey out here, holding a spear, which would have been typical of that time. The question arises, how do we know that humans lived here in Arizona 12,000 years ago and that they were hunting these huge mammoths to make a living? People could hunt smaller game, as they almost certainly did. They could gather plants for food, but we know specifically that the people living at that time were hunting mammoths due to the work of the director of the Arizona State Museum in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, who was Dr. Emil Howry. He was one of the most respected archaeologists in the Southwest, And in 1956, I believe it was, he made a discovery at Naco, Arizona, that really revolutionized the interpretation of the human occupation of the Southwest. Prior to Dr. Howery's excavations at the Naco site, the prevailing train of thought among archaeologists was that the first occupants of the southern Arizona probably lived here no earlier than 1 AD. With Dr. Howery's excavations at Naco in the 1950s, he established that people were living here about 12,000 years ago, and also that they displayed a cultural continuity with people much farther east living in New Mexico, Texas, in that area. All of these people were hunting these huge mammoths. You can see from the bones here, these are ribs of the mammoth, a thigh over adjacent to this. We also have a jawbone that gives an idea of their scale. These huge animals were about 12 feet, 13 feet tall at the shoulder. You can see a graphic up on the back of the case that shows the comparison of a human to a mammoth. And you can imagine that trying to kill one of these creatures would be a very, very dangerous activity for a few humans who, with just a flailing leg, could be probably killed almost instantly. The way that Dr. Howery established that humans were hunting these mammoths was by the presence in the rib bones of stone projectile points from spears. You can see that 5 of them are embedded in these bones that we have here. 2 of them are readily visible to you, the gray shapes here. When they excavated the rib bones, they were, I'm sure, just amazed and delighted to find not only the remains of the mammoth initially, but to find the spear points embedded in there. The fact that these people were using spears was a very important technological discovery. Like I said, hunting a mammoth was a very dangerous activity. You would not want to get too close to them. And so it would be important that you had not just a cutting tool, but a way to propel it from a distance and kill a mammoth. Here you can see what we believe these spears were like. They included the stone tip called a Clovis point due to the style of its manufacture. Here you can see about 20 of these that were excavated at the site. And these are almost identical to those found in New Mexico and Texas, which means that there was a broad base of shared knowledge among these people in their hunting technology. Perhaps even more important about these spears, though, was the presence of a foreshaft. That is a detachable shaft that fits into a spear socket that had several advantages. One, it meant that, or most importantly, it meant that you could basically, to use the analogy of a gun and ammunition, spears, a long straight spear shaft would have been rather hard to make, as were the points, but with the points you could have points and foreshafts ready-made so that you could go out into the field with a kit of several of these, and once you threw one spear and stuck the mammoth, the foreshaft stayed in. You could take your spear shaft, reload it, and fire again. It would be very difficult to carry the 8 or 10 spears along. The other advantage is that with a full-length spear hanging out, the elephant would have a better, or the mammoth, I'm sorry, would have a better chance of knocking that spear loose, and with this point falling out. What happened with the foreshaft was that the foreshaft continued, when it got inside the skin, would continue to work in, just like if you've had a thorn in your finger, and so it even did more damage that way. So this discovery of the animals and the fact that they were being hunted by humans was something that really revolutionized the whole picture of the prehistory of North America. And this was one of only a number of major archaeological discoveries and knowledge developed at the Arizona State Museum by Dr. Emil Howry that was on this scale of revolutionary academic endeavor. Another important excavation conducted by Dr. Howry while he was at the Arizona State Museum was at a site called Ventana Cave on the present-day Tohono O'odham Reservation near Tucson. This was a huge cave. You can see a picture of it behind me. Excuse me. That archaeologists discovered had been occupied for a number of years. They began excavating at the highest levels of the cave. Cave of this size would have dirt blown in by the wind. It would have bats living there whose droppings would compost and turn into dirt. And at the surface level, they discovered that within the last 100 years, Tohono O'odham people, or 100 to 200 years, had occupied the cave at certain times of the year. As they excavated lower, they were pleased to find remains of the Hohokam people who lived in the southern Arizona desert from about 1 AD to about 1450. But as they continued excavating, they continued to find cultural remains, evidence that people had been living there all the way back to about 10,000 years ago. Now, 10,000 years ago was about the time that the Paleo-Indian hunters that we just talked about, the Paleo-Indian hunters stopped hunting the giant mammoth because they had become extinct. But that did not mean that the people became extinct. While they were hunting mammoth, they were probably also gathering plants for food, hunting small game, and as these large animals became extinct, they simply changed their lifestyle to adapt to changing conditions. And so here at Ventana Cave, at the lowest levels of the excavation, we see the oldest remains, and then as we work up, they become more recent. But we see this continuity of human occupation in the Southwest. We'll see more of this in just a few minutes. Here we can see some of the evidence that Dr. Howry and other archaeologists discovered at Ventana Cave that indicate this 10,000-year continuity of human occupation. These physical remains, including stone tools in the earlier period, and a variety of things, even including metal artifacts in the latest periods, show both continuity and changes. The continuity shows that people throughout this period were using stone projectile points, arrows, and spears for hunting animals. They used stone tools for scrapers, such as scraping the insides of hides in the tanning process. They also showed a continuity in the use of plants for food. As you start down here at the bottom, you can see what we would perhaps term more crude tools because of the less sophisticated flaking and shaping. But we have projectile points, scrapers, a chopping tool, but a fairly limited toolkit as well, primarily directed toward hunting activities. These date to about 8,000 BC and older, about 10,000 years ago or more. As we come into the more recent periods, we see some changes in the shape of the projectile points. Up here in the Chiricahua period, we see what I suspect are definitely perhaps arrow points. The bow and arrow replaced the atl or throwing stick for the spear, and I cannot tell you exactly when. But we also over here see a mano and metate. This is a grinding slab where people would gather seeds from plants in the desert or the grasslands and then grind them into flour for making probably something comparable to tortillas or some sort of dough products. Up here in the San Pedro period, dating about 3000 BC, roughly up to about 1 AD, we see a variety of tools. The long, much longer elongated projectile points, knives, scrapers, drills for drilling holes in perhaps wood, for wooden tools, a basin metate, a much deeper grinding tool. Here in the Hohokam period, about 1 AD, or beginning about 1 AD to about 1450, we see a number of very important changes. One is the introduction of pottery. You can see a ceramic potsherd here, decorated, carved stone. And another important change, which actually took place in the Southwest quite a bit earlier, was the introduction of the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash. Corn was cultivated in Mexico, we believe, as early as about 5000 BC. In the Southwest, we first see experimentation with cultivation of corn as early as perhaps 2000 BC. In southern Arizona, it probably became prevalent closer to 300 BC or so. And still people at that time were hunting, gathering plant foods, but the cultivation of these crops was becoming a much more important activity. Following the occupation of the Ventana cave by the Hohokam, it was occupied during the historic period by the Tohono people. The people living here in the southern Arizona desert now who may or may not be the descendants of the Hohokam. Both the A'adam people and archaeologists have disagreements, not just between themselves, but rather among themselves. Some A'adam people view themselves as descendants of the Hohokam, some do not, and the same with archaeologists. But in this period, in the Ventana cave, we were seeing machine-made cloth, glass, metal knives, and a variety of fairly recent activities. So that we see that as much as things have changed over the last 12,000 years, there are many things that haven't changed at all, such as using Ventana cave as a seasonal camping site. In 1965, Dr. Howry returned to a Hohokam site known as Snaketown on the Gila River south of Phoenix to conduct major investigations into the Hohokam culture. He had excavated there in the 1930s and discovered a tremendous wealth of artifacts that gave clues to the lifestyles of these people. But there were many questions that remained unanswered, and so in 1965 he went back to re-excavate, to reanalyze, and try to learn more about these intriguing farmers of the southern Arizona desert. This is the items that we're looking at here is a cache of artifacts found near Snaketown, including miniature bowls, effigy figures showing human figures, and perhaps sheep or dogs. This cache very likely had some religious significance or may have been a cache of simply personal wealth, but it makes an intriguing display here and shows a wide variety of the ceramic skills possessed by the Hohokam. We first see the appearance of the Hohokam culture in southern Arizona about 1 AD. By that time, the environment was very much as it is today, with desert plants, cacti such as the towering saguaro that you see here. The rainfall was pretty much what we have today, about 10 to 12 inches a year, with the major difference being that many of the rivers that today are dry flowed probably year-round. Today we pump a lot of water out from underground, and this is called the water table to drop, and so these rivers only tend to flow when it rains now and with the snow melt. But these rivers were the key to life for the Hohokam culture. I had mentioned earlier that the markers of Hohokam culture were the introduction of ceramics and the introduction of cultivated plants, such as corn, beans, and squash. Both of these ideas probably came up from Mexico, we are very certain. However, we do not know whether the Hohokam people were migrants who moved into this region and settled, or whether they were the descendants of people that lived in this region who learned about and adopted the practice of ceramics and agriculture. But we do know that by probably 300 AD or so, the Hohokam had constructed extensive systems of irrigation canals around the present-day Phoenix at the confluence of the Salt and Gila rivers. We see through the years over these, through archaeological excavations, that there were hundreds and hundreds of miles of these canals, built-in systems where they would take several main feeder canals off the river and then have branching canals within those. There was generally a major village of considerable size, perhaps several thousand, as much as several thousand person population at the head of those canals, and then scattered smaller villages down farther on the canal system. This map shows a system near the present-day town of Casa Grande, which was near the Gila River. You can see that this was a tremendous amount of work to build these canals and maintain the canals, which implied that there were sophisticated systems of political governance, social organization, and integration and cooperation to maintain these canal systems. Unlike historians, archaeologists don't have photographs and written descriptions of the people that they study, but they do have a tremendous wealth of resources to learn about the lifestyles and even the physical appearance of people that lived here in Arizona 1,000 years ago. We're looking here at an artist's conception of a Hohokam man, probably dressed ready for a ceremony in his finest jewelry and body painting. You can see some of the features that we think are typical of that period. The face painting with the painted mask around the eyes, the spotted painting on the lower half of the face, the nose plug through the pierced septum of the nose, cheek plugs with the parrot feathers dangling down from them. A hole was pierced in the cheek and the plug inserted through. We see pierced ears and earrings. Many of these styles are becoming popular today among some of the young people. The pendant necklace, bracelets, rings, all of these attributes that went into this visual conception are based on either the objects themselves, such as the rings and the earrings, or the effigy pots that the Hohokam ceramists left behind. You can see here a vessel that is in the shape of a Hohokam man, we believe, with the spotted face painting on the lower half of the face, the mask around the eyes, the pierced nose, pierced ears, the bracelet around the shoulder or upper part of the arm, the pendant necklace. And so these effigy figures give archaeologists an excellent idea of what the Hohokam people looked like. Some of them are so detailed that you can really recognize individuals among these figurines. The geometric paintings around this vessel look like what we would think of as typical southwestern prehistoric pottery designs, but actually we believe that this is a representation of the clothing that the Hohokam people wore. Because ceramics will last for thousands of years, and items like cloth textiles, sandals made from yucca fibers will not, archaeologists do have one problem in documenting Hohokam lifestyle. We know that they made a wide array of textiles. We know that they grew cotton in their fields along with the corn, beans, and squash. But it's frustrating because we have so few evidence of these. But occasionally in the desert, especially in dry caves, the conditions are right to preserve these. And we do have some examples of woven cotton shirts. You can see an image here of one that was found in central Arizona. And the designs are very, very intricate. and also very, very typical of those found during the same period on pottery. You can see over here to the left some more figurines where we see first a Hohokam effigy vessel similar to the other one with the geometric textiles on the left. This is a female figure. Has a similar banded, painted face, the pierced ears, the pierced nose. But over to a little more to the left, you will see a Hohokam man sitting, or we think a man, sitting with wrapped in a blanket. And the desert nights get very, very cold. And so people would not only be wearing clothing, but also have need blankets to wrap in at night. You can see above his hair what we believe is a headdress or hat of some type. The figures next to him show different versions of this same headwear. And another resource that archaeologists have are the figures represented on painted vessels. Down a little lower, you can see what we believe are dancing Hohokam figures. Circle dances are still popular among many of the Indian cultures of the Southwest as social dances, and we believe that the Hohokam probably perform not only social dances but also ceremonial dances. There are large platforms at some of these sites raised up about 4 feet above the surface area that we believe were probably used for religious ceremonies. Much of the daily life of a Hohokam person living near present-day Tucson 1,000 years ago would have been directed toward meeting the necessities of life: food, clothing, shelter. They did a great deal of hunting deer, rabbits, small animals, gathering plant foods such as the fruit of the saguaro cactus, carrying water. Many villages were often near the rivers, but sometimes they were several miles away, and people were carrying water that distance every day. Building houses. Here you can see a Hohokam pit house that I mentioned, so called because it was excavated into the ground about 2 or 3 feet, probably to keep it cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. Then covered with a framework of poles were planted in the ground, covered with brush, and then covered with mud that would provide more insulation. But much of the living activities were carried on outside. But once the necessities of life were met, the Hohokam still had time, and we see evidence of this in the luxury goods that they produced. We find that they were not only highly skilled ceramists, but also excellent jewelers. They imported shell from as far away as the Sea of Cortez and the Pacific Ocean to make jewelry that was then traded throughout the Southwest, as far away as northern New Mexico, southern Colorado. You can see the bracelets, the turquoise necklaces, the pendants, carved shell such as the frog figures up top, which we see in such great number that these may have had some sort of significance as either religious significance or perhaps a clan symbol. But the Hohokam were known far and wide for their exquisite craftsmanship and the production of large quantities of luxury goods. Down here we see another technique that was very significant in that this was the etched shell technique that I mentioned at the beginning of this program. They would use an acid bath to etch designs into a shell. In Europe, acid etching was a technique that was developed, I think it was about 1400, and the Hohokam were doing it about 200 years earlier than that. What they would do is paint a shell with a resist material, a material that would resist the effects of the acid. They'd cover the whole shell, carve out a design, leaving the resist material in the shape of a lizard or a geometric design, and then etch or immerse that into an acid material like a, say, probably fermented saguaro cactus juice, and the unresisted part of the shell would be eaten away, leaving the design raised above it. And so then this could be, you can see the fragment on the right has the etched designs in a geometric shape. Around 1100 AD, we see radical changes in the social organization, the community organization, and probably the political hierarchy of the Hohokam. We see a change from pit houses, round pit houses or oval-shaped pit houses, to rectangular adobe structures that were built sometimes multi-storied in rectangular compounds, often with walled plazas. Up here at the upper photograph, you can see through continued occupation some of these rectangular areas that were built on top of the earlier pit houses. This is quite common to have hundreds of years of occupation in one village. But we see at that time what we think were changes in the political structure. And many of these changes occurred within the changes in the architecture, the changes in the site plan, changes in what we believe were the religious life. On these platform mounds that I mentioned, it appears that perhaps a religious elite began to live on these platform mounds, which became walled in first so that most of the people were not able to see what was going on there, and then eventually turned into became these multi-storied houses. So there were radical changes among the Hohokam, and then about 1400 AD, the Hohokam culture seems to have collapsed. The collapse of the Hohokam culture around 1400 or 1450 AD was typical of what we also see in other cultures of the Southwest, such as the Anasazi and the Mogollon cultures in northern Arizona and central Arizona, respectively. We really don't know what was going on at that time, as I mentioned, what the reason for these population movements and upheavals, and perhaps even the vanishing of certain peoples. But regardless of what happened, it does speak to the process of cultural diversity and cultural change that has been a part of the Southwest for thousands and thousands of years. Just as the Hohokam culture became an integral cultural entity around 1 AD and survived until about 1450 AD, the same was true about the Mogollon culture and the Anasazi culture. There were other cultures farther west. We have what is referred to as the Hakatayan culture, close to the Colorado River. And so there were a variety of peoples living in this region that probably spoke different languages, definitely had different forms of religion, different cultural practices, but all practiced agriculture, ceramics, and hunting and gathering as a way of making a living. One thing we do know is that the Anasazi people did not totally vanish from this region. Their descendants are found today among the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, the Hopi peoples of Arizona, and they demonstrate a great deal of cultural continuity with the Hohokam people. And of course today we see still a tremendous cultural diversity in this region, with people of other cultural backgrounds such as the Navajo and the Apache Athabascan speakers who probably migrated here from Canada around 1300 AD. We see the Seri farther south in Mexico, the Tarahumara, the Tohono O'odham and Akamela O'odham that I've mentioned, and of course immigrants originally from Europe, Anglo-Americans, Hispanic Americans, and the cultural diversity of the Southwest today remains to be a very important part of our culture. I mentioned the cultural diversity of the Southwest at approximately 1100 A.D. when this cliff dwelling would have been lived in. The Mogollon people were very different from the Hohokam in many respects. The type of houses they lived in, probably the language they spoke, as I mentioned. We see differences in their decorated pottery, in the tools that they made, that indicate that there were definitely different cultural backgrounds, different ways of living, different values, different beliefs between the Hohokam and the Mogollon. What is especially valuable for archaeologists in these cliff-dwelling sites is the tremendous preservation that was provided by these dry caves. The caves were usually dark, which meant that the light did not fade organic materials like cloth. Because they were dry, you didn't have fluctuations in humidity that tended to rot materials, and also provided a great home for bacteria. So because of this, the preservation of these dry caves, from this type of site, archaeologists are able to obtain and study a tremendous variety of artifacts such as sandals, clothing, basketry, and other items that are a tremendous resource for knowledge. And so we see that these, not only do different cultures provide different information about each culture for the archaeologists, but because they can provide different resources, we can find that archaeologists can apply this material cross-culturally. For instance, A.E. Douglas at the Arizona State Museum in the 1920s developed the science of dendrochronology, or tree ring dating. This allowed archaeologists to place absolute years on the building timbers of a site. And so, although only the Anasazi sites have the timbers, they can cross-date these to Hohokam ceramics found that were traded there and date the Hohokam sites. The Arizona State Museum exhibits not only deal with the prehistoric peoples of Arizona, but also the contemporary American Indians. This exhibit, The Yellowware Road, 7 Centuries of Hopi Pottery, shows the continuity between prehistoric Hopi potters and the contemporary artists making pottery in Arizona today. But this is not just a collection of 100 of some of the finest Hopi ceramics that you will find in the country. We also try to convey some of the information that our researchers, archaeologists at the site of Homalavi near the Hopi Reservation, bring to the analysis of ceramics. And so in this exhibit, we start out at the prehistoric period and show how archaeologists analyze pottery, and then some of the kinds of information about prehistoric and historic Hopi life that they have discovered through the ceramics, and then bring this up to the present day with a look at contemporary Hopi artists. When we developed this exhibit on Hopi pottery, our first goal was to get our collections out on display for people to admire the aesthetics of the ceramics. But consistent with our exhibit philosophy, we wanted to do much more than that. And so first we wanted to tell people, how do archaeologists actually study this material culture that lets them learn about Hopi life? And so in discussions with our archaeologists here at the museum, we found that they study basically 3 factors: shape, surface treatment, and composition. What is the pot actually made of? From shape, archaeologists can discover many things, not just what the use of the pot was. Here on the right, we see a broken piece of pottery with a slightly curved lip. Many people think archaeologists usually study whole pots, but that's not the case. For every whole pot you get at a site, you'll have 5,000 to 10,000 potsherds. From the shape of this rim, we know that potsherd could only have come from a bowl such as this, because that is the standard shape that Hopi people made. the rim curve would be within a certain variance. We can also see shapes such as the gourd container here. We saw at the Mugione exhibit a gourd canteen. Hopi people historically still used the gourd as a canteen, but even when they made ceramic carrying vessels or water carrying vessels, they often, or just for fun, they would make it in the shape of the gourd. Here we have what is called a shoe pot. It was a cooking pot, and it had that shoe shape because the point of the toe could be shoved into a cooking fire and leave the outside of the pot so that you could grab the rim and hold it out. So the shape tells us a lot about aspects of daily life. In recent years especially, archaeologists have begun to focus more and more on the composition of pots. What exactly was the clay made up of? What were the decorations made of? And this can be very important because archaeologists are now able to discover the sources of the clay used in pottery. This means that they can by taking a sample of the clay and using a technique called neutron activation analysis, they can come up with a list of all of the trace elements in the clay. They can then go to the clay deposits and test those trace elements until they make a match. That can then tell them that this pot found in one site in northeastern Arizona may have actually been made from clay dug 50 or 75 miles away. So it enhances our knowledge about those trade networks, who was making pottery. Among the Hopi today, this is often based on families. It's a technique that the women practice that is passed down to their daughters, and so this helps us analyze residential patterns and other aspects of Hopi life 500 years ago. One thing we do know about the Hopi from their ceramics is that the Hopi yellowware, because of it was of such high quality and exceptional aesthetic design, that it was traded throughout the western United States. Hopi yellowware is found as far away as California and Kansas. I believe there were sites that in Wyoming. There was quite a trade in obsidian as a luxury good, and pottery will appear at sites where obsidian is found. Another popular trade route, aside from the one to California that I mentioned for shells, was trade with Mexico. Parrots were used in religious ceremonies by the Hopi and many other people, and we find evidence of Hopi yellowware at sites down as far south as northern Mexico, around Casas Grandes, and also find the parrot skulls in Hopi sites, and also find the parrot designs in the Hopi effigy bowls here, and the designs painted on the pottery. So we see, it's tough to imagine a person carrying 10 or 15 pots on his or her back, climbing up and down these mountain canyons, but people were definitely doing it. Much more recently, there have been changes in Hopi life that ceramics can also speak to. Prior to about 1900, almost all Hopi ceramics were made for functional purposes. Cooking pots, eating bowls, storage vessels. But around 1900, we saw a change in the ceramics which reflected a change in the economy. As American traders moved in, the Hopi became caught up in a cash economy, and so they had to provide something that they could sell for this cash. And ceramics were, by and large, for the Hopi, that item. You can see here a change in forms. Candlesticks, much more recently wind chimes, bowls that, such as this one with the frog, had two pendants for hanging. It's a somewhat traditional shaped bowl, but it was made to be hung from the ceiling and has nothing to do with serving food or any of the traditional activities. Today, Hopi ceramics have become a highly prized art form, and say much about the Hopi's role in the world of southwestern Indian arts and crafts. In the 1990s, Hopi ceramics still display much of a continuity with Hopi ceramic traditions. Similarities in form, decoration, surface treatment persist, but we also see many changes. New forms such as this here, the totally undecorated surface with the sculpted ears of corn, is something that you never would have seen among the Hopi potters in 1800. Another change is that while ceramics were always made by women, today we have male Hopi potters, such as Al Koyawama, pictured here with the pot that I just mentioned. And so there is a great deal of experimentation, a great deal of aesthetic diversity, but still Hopi potters remain true to their cultural traditions and their craft. The Hopi Reservation is located in northeastern Arizona, where the Hopi villages have been since about about 1200 AD or so. This is a picture of the village of Walpi, located on First Mesa. It was built around 1680 and is, I believe, probably the oldest continuously occupied community in North America. While Hopi people still live in this pueblo, they also have modern houses of wood frame and cinder block with electricity and running water. And you can see here a picture of a Hopi farm with a pickup truck. And Hopi life in many ways is no different from ours today, although their cultural traditions and religion and language are, of course, very different. This cultural continuity and continuum is illustrated through the yellowware pottery. Hopi yellowware is a term for a type of ceramics with a yellow clay after it is fired, which is commonly decorated with black and sometimes red slips. Around 1300 was when we see the first appearance of this specific type of pottery. Prior to that, the Hopi people were making a black on orange pottery and black on white pottery, the black and white being typical of the prehistoric Anasazi people. But it was only the Hopi that learned to collect this gray clay when it was raw, that when fired turned yellow and provided a really beautiful background for the painted designs. You can see a continuum here of the changes of the Hopi yellowware from about 1450 up to about 1600. And then beginning again over here on the left, we see the introduction around the mid-1600s of a red glaze which became a polychrome. Poly referring to multiple colors on the pottery. We see here around the 1800s the influence of Spanish aesthetics, the rosettes. Much of this was as the Hopi people had more contact with the pueblos in New Mexico and Zuni. And then up in the modern day, we see what we think of today as classic Hopi yellowware pottery of the late 1800s and early 1900s, which ironically was really a revival of prehistoric Hopi styles that potters became aware of as archaeologists excavated prehistoric sites near the Hopi mesas. And so we have come full circle with this cultural tradition. And then with this last piece on the far right, a contemporary piece that has carved designs as well as painted designs, we see a lot of innovation today in the ceramic tradition and techniques. Well, I know Arnold was very excited about the exhibits that we saw on the Paleo-Indian hunters, the Hohokam, the Mogollon, and the Hopi pottery, but we're even more excited about a new exhibit that will open in November of 1993. This is entitled Paths of Life, American Indians of the Southwest, and it tells the stories of 10 cultural groups in the Southwest 10 different Indian cultures. These include the Seri, the Tarahumara, the Yaqui, the A'adam people, the Colorado River human speakers, the Southern Paiutes, the Pai peoples, the Apache, Navajo, and Hopi. And this is a major new exhibit for us. It's about half of our building that we will occupy in the future. We're going to eventually close our old exhibit gallery after we complete exhibits over here. So this is a major project. I've been working on it since 1986, and we have put together a total funding package of about $1.7 million to provide the public with a new educational experience about the contemporary Indians of the Southwest. For each of the 10 groups, as you can see here, we take a single theme of cultural relevance to that group and trace it through their view of their origins, their history, and their life today. So in this process, we try to examine the cultural values that are important to the different cultures of the Southwest and integrate those historical traditions, those cultural traditions that every group people has, and show how they affect life in the 20th century. This gallery is quite large, and it takes up about half the ground floor of our new building. And if you peek right in here, you can see some of the exhibit cases are nearing completion. We still have some of them wrapped in cellophane, as you can see, to keep the dust off. But this is what we will be glad to show you in November 1993 if you visit the Arizona State Museum in Tucson, Arizona.
Bruce, just a quick question. How many square feet will there be in this new museum, approximately?
Well, the exhibit gallery for the entire area will be about 25,000 square feet. The Paths of Life exhibit will be about 10,000 square feet, so it's almost half of that new building.
That's exciting. Will you invite us back maybe when that's finished?
So we'll be glad to.
We appreciate your hospitality, and we appreciate your information. I know the people will really enjoy what you've shared with them. Thanks a lot, Bruce.
Thank you for coming.